Okay, so hopefully you can all see this. So yes, this talk will outline palaeoenvironmental investigations made into prehistoric farming using sediment from Lough Inchiquin. So pollen analysis was the technique used for this investigation, and this was linked to the archaeological record to provide an account of landscape change and associated human activity. So this is just a little overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So this research was carried out as part of my PhD project. So I'll go over the aims and objectives of this research, why this area was chosen for investigation, and very briefly, what archaeology is already known from the area. Then I'll go into the palaeoenvironmental investigations themselves. For the results, I'll go through in chronological periods and also comment on the archaeological record as well. Then some concluding thoughts on how this has added to our knowledge of the area, and specifically insights into prehistoric farming. So the main aim of the research was to understand the nature of changing human-environment interactions during prehistory. So by using pollen analysis, what could we discover about the landscape of the southern Burren and how this changed through time? Could this then be linked to human activity? And then could we see patterns of human activity through time as well? And finally, how would the pollen record relate to the archaeological record of the region? So why investigate the Burren? So I'm sure I don't have to tell you what a fantastic place this is in terms of both landscape and archaeology. It's a landscape that has been exploited since the Neolithic, and both the archaeological record and previous pollen studies attest to its importance in prehistory. However, previous studies have all been confined to small lake basins, which only provide local signals of land use. So generally, the larger the lake, the bigger the catchment area for the pollen will be. The Lough Inchiquin record can provide a broader picture of land use dynamics across a wider region of the southern Burren. So on this map here, you can see Lough Inchiquin is down here, and then this black outline is the estimated catchment area. And this has been estimated to be just over 93 kilometers squared. And you can see also on this map that we have a high number of sites within the catchment area, and then they also extend further across the Burren to the north. So they're classified by chronological periods. So we have portal tombs, court tombs, we have various enclosures and wedge tombs. So we have all of this really interesting archaeology within the catchment. Then these red stars on the map, these indicate where previous pollen studies have taken place. So there's a really small lake called Molly's Loch, a really small enclosed lake that's just next to Lough Inchiquin. And then there's a few more that have been looked at in the east and a few in the north as well. So investigations like this can take advantage of the continuous record that's provided by lake sediments. And these essentially act as an archive of environmental change. Sediment accumulation is generally a constant process. So you get this stratigraphic sequence of indicators such as the pollen. This is in contrast to the archaeological record, which is more episodic and it contains biases of preservation. So for example, the monuments of early prehistory clearly dominate the Burren landscape. The use of pollen analysis then can help develop our understanding of its prehistory and fill in any gaps we may have in our interpretations. So I just want to cover some of the basics of pollen analysis before we really get into the results of this study, just so we're all on the same page as to how this all works and how it can aid interpretations. So pollen is released annually into the atmosphere. It all mixes together and then eventually gets deposited within a context. So this might be a peat bog or a lake. So you can see in this image here, this is a photo of Lough Inchiquin. And it's just really to demonstrate that pollen can come from the wider environment, and it can also come from plants and the surrounds of the lake, so from really close by. The sediments in the lake are anaerobic, there are waterlogged conditions, so the pollen can survive for thousands of years. The outer walls of the grains are made up of a polymer called sporopollenin, and this can withstand most forms of degradation. We can then come along and we can take a sediment core from the lake bed and we can do analysis on this. So this is then the primary technique for looking at past vegetation and paleo environments. The pollen grains themselves have these unique sculpturing features. So you can get pores, which are basically just little holes on the surface of the grain. And you can also get furrows, which are like lines that run down the grain. And you can also get a combination of the two. And it's generally the number and location of these that can help us to tell the different grains apart. When we analyze a sample, we count the number of each taxa that we see under the microscope, and we aim for a total of 1,000 grains per sample. And this is excluding the pollen of plants that would grow within the lake itself. We then divide that data into different categories. So these would be trees, shrubs, pastoral indicators, arable indicators, bog taxa, and then aquatic plants as well. And pollen data can tell us a variety of different things. So we can obviously get information on past vegetation, but then within this, we can identify periods of woodland clearance. We can look at whether people were engaging in pastoral farming or arable farming. And we can look at the duration and intensity of these things. So importantly, we can look at the timing of environmental change and then look at how this may be associated with human activity. There are certain species that thrive in disturbed environments. These tend to have a low dispersal capacity, so the pollen doesn't go too far away from the plant itself. And so these can often be underrepresented in a pollen record. So that's why it's important to have this high pollen count of 1,000 grains per sample in order to increase the chances of encountering these rarer indicators that we can associate then with people. Plantago lanceolata is one of the most important indicators, so that is ribwort plantain here. And when we see this alongside a suite of other pastoral taxa, it's indicative of human activity and the opening up of a landscape. And then when we see this alongside a significant decrease in tree pollen, that's when we can call it a landnam. So people are coming along, they're clearing the land of trees to make way for pasture land for farming. These are just some examples of these types of pastoral or anthropogenic indicators, just to give you an idea of what they look like. So we have grass here, that just is quite a simple grain, just with one pore. We have ribwort plantain, we have the dock, buttercup, clover, meadowsweet, dandelion, and daisy. So some of them are really distinct. A lot of these are quite small as well when you're looking for them in a sample. Just to give you an idea of these different types. And we can also identify crop cultivation as well. So cereal type grains are characteristic in that they're much larger than other grains, and they also have a large distinct pore and annulus. So hopefully you can see that on these images. The pore and annulus is just here. So cereals are self-pollinating. So again, these can be very underrepresented in pollen records. So even if you've counted these 1,000 grains, you may only get a handful of cereal type pollen to suggest that they may have been engaging in arable agriculture. Sometimes you can also identify arable weeds, so other plants that were likely growing with these crops as well. Okay, so we're just going to swing back now to Lough Inchiquin itself and take a closer look at the lake and why it was chosen. So a lot of you will know where Lough Inchiquin is. It's just northwest of Corofin. And it was chosen both due to its large size, so it's around 110 hectares, but also its proximity to the archaeology of the southern Burren. Specifically, the area of Rowan Hill, which has a dense concentration of sites. This is only 3 kilometers to the north of the lake. The River Fergus rises to the south of Rowan Hill, And this also runs into the lake. So not only will pollen be a regional signal because of this large size, but we're also going to get pollen that has been drained from across a wider area of the Burren Plateau with the river, and it's been brought into the lake then. It has a maximum depth of 30 meters. And as I think I said before, the catchment area is calculated to be just over 93 kilometers squared. So the first thing that we had to do then was to extract a sediment core from the lake. So we did this actually in June 2015. So these are just some images to give you an idea of the fieldwork involved. So this is using a piston corer. So when we're doing a lake, we basically assemble this raft. So it has these 4 pontoons underneath, which allow it to float on the lake. And one of the first things we have to do is then get it into position. So we always aim to core in the deepest part of the lake. So in this case, that was at 30 meters. And so it's a case of finding that point and then trying to keep the raft in that position. And we do this using a combination of anchor bags and also tying a line to trees at the shoreline as well. Now, I remember distinctly doing this on a really windy day, and every time that we got it into position, there'd be a gust of wind and it would just float off. So it can be quite tricky. I think we were there until 10:30 that night, but we got there in the end. So once it's in position, we had to then lower down 30 meters. So there's a hole in the middle of the raft here. And we basically lower down 30 meters of big metal tubing, essentially, which then creates a tunnel. So it's attached to the bottom of the raft and it goes all the way down to the lake bed. So this creates a tunnel through which we can drive the corer. Now, the coring tube itself is basically just a cylindrical tube. It's 2 meters in length and it's 8 centimeters in diameter. So we use a number of metal rods to lower that down to the lake bed, and then that's manually driven into the sediment. So we can then collect that 2 meters of sediment, we bring it all back up, and we use a boat then to take the coring tube to the lakeside. So then at the lakeside, it's extruded. So we have this contraption, and it basically pushes a metal disc through the coring tube and then pushes out the sediment. And then we can go back down the same hole and get the next 2 meters and so on. So that's essentially how the coring works. And we think actually this might be the deepest core ever taken in Ireland through the 30 meters of water. And then we got over 10 meters of sediment, so 40 meters in total. So this is the full profile of the lake sediment core from Lough Inchiquin. So we got 10.59 meters of sediment. The red outline then indicates the section that I used for my analysis. We generally stop when we get to this glacial clay at the bottom. So that's an indicator to us that we have the whole Holocene sequence, as long as everything's nice and normal. So in this picture here, you can see this white dashed line. That's, we think, the Younger Dryas. So around 11.5 thousand years ago. And then we come up here to the white arrow. It's the early Neolithic, up through the middle and late Neolithic. We have the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, up through the middle Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, into the Iron Age. And then if we continued on, and a couple of people have been using this core for extra studies, we have the medieval period, and then up into the more modern stuff. In order to radiocarbon date the core, I then took slices of 1 centimeter across the sediment. And I basically wet sieved this for material suitable for dating. So it needed to be fragments of wood or terrestrial plant material. So you can see in this image here, we had sometimes you find little fragments that are big enough, and other times you have to go through and look under the microscope and pull out loads of tiny little pieces. So we ended up with 7 accepted dates, and then we could use these to create an age depth model. And this basically uses statistics to produce a calibrated year BC or AD for each centimeter of the core. In order to turn the sediment into pollen samples, we have to use chemical processing. So first off, we take subsamples. So we generally only use 1 centimeter cubed for the actual analysis. So we take subsamples of that and then put it through various chemical treatments. So we use things like potassium hydroxide, hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid, glacial acetic acid, and then a process called acetylysis, which uses a couple of different chemicals. And we also sieve the material at various different stages as well. And the aim basically is to remove all of the material bar the pollen grains. And also a byproduct of doing this is that it stains the grains as well. So this can aid in identification. So once you've gone through all these processing steps, you end up with a sample that you can mix with glycerol. And then you can basically just pop a couple of drops onto a slide. And then that's what you analyze under the microscope. So in all, I analysed 90 samples, so that's over 90,000 pollen grains counted. And this is an example of the view you might get when you're looking at a pollen slide, just gives you an idea. So there is normally a little bit of debris left, but it's pretty clear and you can see there are 4 little pollen grains there. So this is the pollen diagram for Lough Inchiquin. And this is the standard way that we represent pollen data. As I said before, we divide this data into different categories. So the blue is the trees. We have shrubs and ferns. The green then are these pastoral or anthropogenic indicators. The red curves are cereal or arable. We then have bog taxa and aquatic taxa in blue. This black curve then is microcharcoal, so that can be used to indicate periods of woodland clearance and things. On the left here is a composite diagram. So this is all percentage data. So when we have high levels of the blue, that's more woodland. And then when the green increases, that's indicating an expansion of pastureland. So these diagrams can be quite hard to read, especially on little screens like this. So for these chronological periods, I've made some pie charts, which will hopefully be a bit easier to see these general trends in the landscape. With those, though, it's important to remember that that's taking an average for each chronological period. So we can get stuck into the results now. So the profile opens in the late Mesolithic, so around 4,600 BC, and we have a mixed deciduous woodland. The main tall canopy tree would have been oak, so this is the oak pollen here, and this would have been accompanied by elm and pine. So I've just given an example of an elm pollen here, and then pine here, which is really distinctive. Hazel would have been an important understory component, so this is the pollen of hazel top here. We also have an expansion of alder. So alder is this pollen here. And this occurred around 4,330 BC. And in the Inchiquin record, this marks the Boreal to Atlantic transition. Now we move into the early Neolithic. So this is when people first started to have a significant influence on their environment. The elm decline occurred around 4,060 BC. And this is seen across Ireland and was likely a result of disease and perhaps climate, and then also maybe associated human activity. You can see that the amount of pastureland here has increased in this period. So what we have is a 2-phase landnam which spanned for 5 centuries. So trees were cleared from this landscape to make way for species-rich grassland. So we had the clearance of elm, oak, and hazel. And then in the grasslands, we had the species that you would find in a modern day meadow. So things like grasses, ribweb plantain, dock, buttercups, etc. We also get the first appearance of cereal type pollen, suggesting a minor arable component to this early Neolithic farming. These are just a couple of examples of the pollen grains. So again, that's the grass and then the ribweb plantain there. Now, this expansion of pastureland in the early Neolithic was identified elsewhere in the Burren as well, in these smaller lake signals, but it's much more significant in the catchment of Lough Inchiquin. So while the landscape was becoming more open, we have activity at portal tombs in the landscape. So Ballycasheen is a ruined portal tomb, which is just around 2.5 kilometers from the lake. And then, of course, we have the spectacular Pollen, which lies just a little outside the catchment area to the north. We also have activity on Rowan Hill with the construction of Parc na Bine Court Tomb. So this occurred around 3700 BC. And we have others as well in this area, which would all have been used during this landnam phase. So both the archaeology and the pollen attest to increased human activity in this period. During the middle and into the late Neolithic, there was a period of woodland regeneration in the catchment of Inchiquin and across the wider Burren landscape as well. So this woodland started to expand from around 3550 BC. Again, we had a woodland made up of elm and oak, and you would have had hazel and alder in the understory. We also get two new tree species at this time. So ash and yew both become established from around 3200 BC. So this is an example of ash pollen here, and this is the yew pollen. And this woodland regeneration was actually widespread across Ireland and into Britain during this time. And in most pollen records in Ireland, you see these two species becoming established. So these are both quite light-dependent species. So it could be that after the woodland has been altered by this earlier human activity, they've had a chance to flourish more. So during this time, when we have this contraction of the pasture land and expansion of woodland, we do still have activity across the landscape. The Pulawack Lincolnstown kiss dates to the middle of this period. We also have continued deposition at Parc na Bine Court Tomb and at Pollen. So you can see this graph here is of radiocarbon dates, and this highlights the overlap in the use of these three monuments. There's also a date of around 3080 BC from a habitation site at Tisca. So this is potentially highlighting settlement activity at this time. We get renewed clearance of trees from around 2850 BC, which allows grasslands to become established once more across the southern Burren landscape. So again, we have grasses, ribwort plantain, dock, meadowsweet, dandelions, etc. And this return to farming is a trend seen across Ireland from roughly around 2700 BC. We also have an arable component with cereal type pollen identified as well. So this is an example of one of the cereal grains that actually dates to the late Neolithic at Inchiquin. Now, we also did further studies on the Lough Inchiquin sediments. I don't have time to go fully into that today, but this included geochemistry. And the results of this suggest that the beginnings of substantial erosion of Burren soils occurred contemporaneously with this reinitiation of farming activity in the late Neolithic. Known activity within the Inchiquin catchment is concentrated at the Parc na Bine Court Tomb. So we have the blocking off of Chamber 2, but we have the continued deposition into Chamber 1. We get a further expansion of pasture land as we come into the Chalcolithic. So now there would have been more open areas that were being used more intensively. Woodland clearance seems to target oak and alder, and there's also a second elm decline, which may also have been to do as much with disease as with human activity. For the first time, we get significant levels of bracken. So this is the spore of the bracken fern, and this colonizes newly cleared areas. We again also have increased cereal type pollen, so we now have increased mixed farming at this time. So again, I've just thrown up some examples of these pastoral indicators and the meadow plants that would have been across the southern Burren. An intensification of this mixed farming occurred from around 1810 BC. So we had a further expansion of pasture land across the southern Burren, along with increased arable agriculture. Interestingly, at this time, we have a small peak in freshwater algae, which suggests that this farming activity is causing the lake to become nutrient enriched. So this is the algae here, this is Pediastrum. The geochemistry that we did also suggests that this erosion of Burren soils would have continued until at least 1700 BC, which would also add to this. This new data from Inchiquin and also the other Burren pollen records correspond with a general increase in farming across Ireland at this time. There's definitely an increased visibility of archaeological remains from the Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age. So we have the densest concentration of wedge tombs in the country in the Burren. So 15 of these are on Rowan Hill, with more then at Ballygana and then in the Pollen Depression. A few of these have been excavated recently by the Irish Field School of Prehistoric Archaeology. So this is Park Nabinia wedge tomb here, and this is a smaller one just across the fields from there, where there were still some cremated remains within the chamber. So I was lucky enough to get to excavate part of that. And they also excavated a barrow up on Knockloon Hill, where they got evidence of cremations dating to this time. On Rowan Hill, we have a system of 4 settlements and fields which extend over 370 acres. And this is contemporaneous with this intensification of farming that we see in the pollen record. With Rowan Hill just 3 kilometers away, it's likely that activity here is reflected in the pollen that we're seeing. So this has been modeled to be around 2300 to 1550 BC. We also have evidence from Teesga again, this habitation site, where there are also field systems. And then we have habitation sites and field systems at Coolnatulla as well. So we can perhaps think of this period as a distinct farming phase in the southern Burren, which is reflected both in the archaeological record and in the palaeoenvironmental data. There was also secondary reuse of earlier monuments. So we see activity at the Park Nabinia court tomb, where cremations were inserted in both the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age. Kists were inserted at Pullowack Cairn around 2000 BC. So this image here is the Coolnatulla Cairn. So this has 2 phases of burial, one in the Chalcolithic, and then again, once we get into this more intensive agricultural phase in the early Bronze Age. And this is also around the same time that we get the fetus burial inserted into the portico at Brome. So we have loads of evidence for both settlement and burial during this phase. In the Middle Bronze Age then, after we've had this distinct period of farming activity, we actually have another period of woodland regeneration. So this isn't quite as obvious on the pie chart because that's taking the averages, but if we look at the actual curve, you can see that the pastoral indicators drop right down here. The start of this is actually broadly contemporary with the end of use of these Rowan Hill habitation sites, so that's quite interesting. So at this time, we have widespread hazel woodland, and we also have things like elm coming back. We have ivy and holly as well growing on the outskirts. So the area that was given over to pasture land did decrease, but there's still evidence of smaller scale pastoral farming. And we do also see some arable cultivation as well. Interestingly, we have a decrease in this freshwater algae that I was talking about in the preceding period. So perhaps indicating that any continued farming was occurring further away from the lake. In terms of archaeology, we have more evidence from the burial record rather than for settlement at this time. So we have a secondary inhumation within a cairn surrounding a wedge tomb on Rowan Hill that's been dated to the Middle Bronze Age. So these are the remains here within the cairn material. We also have 2 phases of burial activity at Pullowack Kist. Then up at Glencurran Cave, which is around 6 kilometers to the north of Lough Inchiquin, we have a phase of ritual activity. So a cairn was identified that's been associated with human bones and rich artifacts such as these amber beads. It's also likely that some of the burnt mounds across the landscape date to this period. So the only excavated example is at Fahy South, which has been dated to 1408 to 1219 BC. So it's likely that some more of these burnt mounds that go across this landscape would have dated to this period and would provide settlement evidence. As we come into the late Bronze Age, we identified a significant landmass spanning for 500 years. Woodland was cleared and there was targeted clearance of hazel for the first time. People were now intensively farming the landscape of the southern Burren, both for pastoral and arable agriculture. In the middle of this period, there was a century where this declined and allowed for some regeneration of hazel, birch, and willow. But again, this was subsequently cleared. We had particularly intense periods of activity in the 12th and the 9th centuries BC. And throughout this whole period, we have crop cultivation. Interestingly, we identified a rapid and significant expansion of freshwater algae and aquatic plants such as water lily, which suggests that the lake was becoming much more productive. So although we have this really large catchment because of Inchiquin being such a big lake, this is telling us that some of this activity would have been happening in the immediate surrounds of the lake. In terms of late Bronze Age archaeology, we don't have anything from these immediate surrounds, although we now know people must have been active there. But there is evidence from within the catchment further to the north. So at Glencoran Cave, we have another phase of really interesting ritual activity. There were a number of individuals found associated with late Bronze Age artifacts. One of these individuals was a juvenile who's been dated to 800 to 730 BC. So their burial dates to this second phase of the late Bronze Age landnam. There were late Bronze Age dates at the Tisca habitation site and at an enclosure on the Carron Plateau. And this may indicate settlement activity associated with this landnam phase, because these dates come from the 12th century BC and the 10th century BC. Much further north then, we have activity at Turlock Hill with hut sites dated to the late Bronze Age. And then there are artifacts that have been found, such as the Glensheen Gorget. At the very end of the late Bronze Age, we have a slight reduction in farming pressure, and this continued until around 430 BC, at which point we get another intensification of mixed farming that went on to characterize the early Iron Age. So I don't actually have a pie chart for this period, but if we just look at the composite, you can see the increased trees here, and then pastoral increases again, and then it starts to fall again. So from around 210 BC, we get some of this woodland recoveries. This would have been both the tall canopy species such as oak and then hazel as well. Until recently, the Iron Age of the region was mostly known through artifacts. For example, an iron spearhead and 2 bridle bits were discovered close to the lake. However, recent excavations have led to new discoveries from this period. So I helped to excavate a partial inhumation, which was found just outside of the Parknabinia wedge tomb. And this turned out to be Iron Age in date, so around 400 to 200 BC. And there were actually 2 stab wounds on the ribs of this individual. So this is the rib bone here, and you can see these 2 thin lines. So these are thought to be stab wounds. So this individual was buried here during this period of Iron Age farming. They also got further evidence from the barrow on Knockloon Hill. So as well as these earlier cremations, they also got high status glass bead making for the site. So to summarize everything that I've gone through, so by doing this pollen investigation, we were able to produce a detailed reconstruction of landscape change and associated human activity through prehistory. Because of the large size of the lake, this could be done at a broader scale, which allows us to link the data with more of the archaeology of the southern Burren than before. Overall, the late Bronze Age emerges as the period with the most intensive farming activity. The enrichment of the lake during this time also suggests that some of this was in the landscape immediately surrounding the lake itself. So although at first glance, the monumental archaeology of early prehistory seems the most visible and the most significant, so we had this dense concentration of Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age sites, it's actually the late Bronze Age when this landscape becomes the most important in terms of a farming economy. So the data has confirmed the persistence of farmers in this area of the southern Burren into later prehistory. So these are the published papers that have come from this research, if any of you do want to read up on more detail about any parts of this. So this first one here is basically the same as this talk, so runs through all of the pollen, but it also compares it with these other smaller profiles that have been done across the east and the north of the area. And then the second paper really goes more into the palaeolimnology that we did, so the geochemistry. We did chironomids, which are these non-biting midge flies, and the soil erosion as well. So if you don't have access to online journals, if you go to this webpage, that's my ResearchGate profile, and there you can access all the papers online, and you can also freely download them as well. So thank you very much. I was delighted to get invited to give a talk here. So I hope you've enjoyed it. That's my email there if anyone has any further questions or anything. I post research updates and things on an academic Twitter that I have. And I'm also going to be giving a talk in May at a conference in Kilfenora. So if anyone's there, that talk will be a little bit different. So just in case there was any overlap in the people that were going. So thank you very much.
Daisy, that was fabulous. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. And again, like obviously your passion for it shows through, and it was so beautifully, clearly all laid out. So not too complicated at all. You made it look so easy.
Yeah, it's a breeze.
That was how many years of work again?
Oh gosh, too many.
Too many. So Daisy, that was just absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. If anyone has questions now or any comments you'd like to make, you can pop them into the chat or into the question and answer at the bottom, and we'll get round to as many of them as we can. There's not any there at the moment. I've just got, how many hours did you spend in the lab, Daisy, processing samples?
Yeah, a lot of time. So in the lab, when we start off, we do 8 samples and one go, and then as you get better at it, we do up to 16. That's what the equipment that we have allows. So I had 90 samples that I had to analyze, and you could process 16 at a time, and that would take 2 days. So yeah, it was a long time in the lab. Yeah, you do different batches, and then yeah, just get through it all. And probably the best part of a year kind of analyzing it all. Yeah, because then I did 2 lakes. I also did Rossrow Loch, which is like further down by Muhon Hillfort. So yeah, I was comparing the two. So I think I did 80 something samples from this other lake as well. So it's a lot of pollen.
That's seriously impressive. And if you couldn't sleep at night, you could just count pollen, not sheep.
Yes, yeah, you would see it in your eyes when you went to sleep.
Oh, lovely. We have got a couple of questions coming out. Nancy has said chat is disabled. I've not too sure what's going on with that, but if you've got questions and chat isn't working for you, please put them into the question and answer, because if I start pressing buttons, I might end the whole meeting by accident. I'm actually not going to mess too much. Well, the first question we've got now is when did you carry out this research, and over what time period? Over what period of time?
So I started the PhD in 2014. So we did the fieldwork in 2015. Yeah, and then basically for the next couple of years, I was focusing on this. I think we cored the other lake in 2017, and then I handed it all in at the end of 2018. So it was a 4-year PhD project.
Goodness, and a good chunk of time there.
Yes.
Peter Wise has said wonderful. Will this talk be available online later? And yeah, what we do is it is recorded. In fact, I can actually Oh, I better not mess now. I was going to say I can turn off the recording now with the questions, but Pranjali can edit that bit out later. So the recording of the talk, edited out, so it's just the talk itself, will be available on the Burren BO YouTube channel. So we just take a couple of weeks to put it up there. So you will get all of that. So the slides that Daisy had with where the research papers are and stuff, you'll find them there. So one of the questions was, is it possible to post the location of the research papers? But I think, I mean, what we can do is we can get the papers from you or the links to them, and maybe if members are interested, they can just email the trust and we can pass them on.
Yeah, I can send them on to you. Yeah.
Perfect, brilliant. And Brendan Burgess has said, when did the mid to late Neolithic woodland I'm so bad at reading. What did the mid to late Neolithic woodland regeneration mean? Did the farmers leave?
Yeah, not entirely sure. It seems to be a trend that's seen across Ireland and also into Britain as well. So there are a few studies looking at the density of sites. So they look at all the different radiocarbon dates that they get that span that period. And basically there's a peak beforehand in the early Neolithic, and then it does seem to drop off. So people are wondering if either people kind of sort of contracted to specific areas of the landscape so that not everywhere was used anymore, or sort of whether there were climatic reasons, or whether the gusto of the early Neolithic farmers kind of ran out a bit and they sort of used too many of the resources and things and they hadn't quite got it all kind of up to speed. But it does seem to be a trend that's seen across the whole country, which is interesting and might point to perhaps like a climatic reason for that. Yeah, it's an interesting one though.
Brilliant, thanks Daisy. Andy here has said, is it possible to identify data about animal and poultry farming?
Oh, good question. I don't know about specifically poultry farming. I don't know whether you can determine, I guess when we talk about sort of pastoral farming, we're just assuming more than anything that it would be cattle and sheep probably. You can link it obviously with the archaeological data that you would get from various sites, whether they've got animal bone assemblages and things. But yeah, it would be interesting to know if we could find out whether there were the Neolithic chickens knocking around, but I don't know.
We'll have to excavate more sites maybe and
yes.
chicken bones.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of sieving.
I could imagine. And then we've just got at the bottom, Michael Lynch has just said a great talk. Thank you very much for that. So are there any more talks? Any more questions from any more people out there, or have we kind of reached the end of them all? Like I said, I'm very sorry about the chat not being there. Usually that's when people say thank you very much and they're having to go. So, and like I said, I'm not going to mess with chat. I wouldn't really know anything else on that. So is there any more questions out there at all for Daisy on the talk? I mean, it was Daisy, it was so lovely and clearly laid out. So, you know, it made complete and perfect sense. I think the lack of questions is actually showing.
I did too good a job.
Exactly. Oh, now Peter Wise has said your initial map showed Gortlecker including Lough Galen as well. I'm not too sure what that question is there for. So did you look at the other lochs out there as well?
Yes, so the map indicated all the places that had previously been studied for pollen. So they are two examples, so Gortlecker and Lough Galen. So in the paper, I do go into more, I sort of compare all the pollen records. So I say what I found in the Inchiquin data and how it compares and contrasts to all of these other smaller sites. So yeah, it was really useful. It was great that there were these other pollen studies already there. This was just sort of adding to the overall narrative and doing it, as I say, at a broader scale because of the size of the lake. Generally with palaeoenvironmental investigations, they always want a small lake so that they can say, you know, this was happening in a 500-meter radius or something. But I guess when you're talking more about the people, you know, they weren't just hanging out around the lake itself. So you need to have a further, you know, wider range of environments to look at. So
perfect. Oh, lovely. And that answered that then. Peter said, did you call that and the smaller one to the west, but you had the data there already?
Yes,
so.
Yeah, that wasn't us, but yeah, that was done already.
And so handy that it all tied in together and it
Yes.
all matched up nicely.
Yeah, it was good. And some areas where they sort of got more of woodland regeneration, the wider thing sort of says that while there was still continued farming. So yeah, it was interesting to compare all the different areas.
Absolutely. And it's so lovely to get a feel for what the landscape might have looked like all that way back in time and have an idea about what plants we had and forest cover. And
yeah, it is great, especially with somewhere like the Burren, where you have, you've had all this soil erosion almost up to today, all these black bare limestone patches and things, and to think of it, as like a forested landscape, it's it's kind of crazy, but yeah.
Totally. You need a bit of imagination on your side when you're looking at that.
Yes, yeah.
Lovely. There's no more questions there, Daisy. So thank you again for such a brilliant talk, and so nice and concisely laid out and lovely and clear. So it was absolutely fabulous.